Welcome back to Juvenile Justice Policy CRJU 303A. Today we'll be discussing Chapter 5, Theories of Causation. By the end of this chapter, you'll be able to recognize the key requirements for a good scientific theory and understand why these requirements are essential for studying criminal behavior. We will explore the strengths and limitations of early theories, discussing how they shaped our current understanding of crime and delinquency. We will then move into the foundations of biological theories, examining how physiological factors can play a role in criminality. In particular, we will evaluate the impact of prenatal and neonatal care on the likelihood of future delinquency, considering the research evidence that links early development to behavioral outcomes. Next, we will review early varieties of physiological theories, discussing their focus and relevance in the context of modern criminology. As we examine research relating to theories of causation, you will have the opportunity to evaluate the evidence critically and consider its implications for both policy and practice. Finally, we will consider the significance of combining pre-existing theories to create integrated theories, highlighting how blending different perspectives can provide a more comprehensive understanding of criminal behavior. By the end of this session, you should be able to articulate these concepts clearly and apply them in analyzing both historical and contemporary criminological research. Let us now turn our attention to some of the theories that have been developed to explain offenses committed by and against juveniles. One prominent theory proposes that child abuse and neglect are important causal factors in delinquency. In fact, numerous studies conducted over the past 50 years have suggested links between delinquent behavior and experiences of abuse and neglect. For example, Scudder, Blount, Hyde, and Silverman in their 1993 study observed that children who engage in criminal acts, particularly violent acts, often have a history of maltreatment. Their research further indicates that a child abused at a young age is at a higher risk for subsequent delinquent behaviors compared to children who were not abused. Supporting these findings, Siegel in 2011 reported that as many as 10 million children are exposed to domestic violence in their homes annually, a conclusion echoed by Onescu in 2003. Other researchers have reached similar conclusions. Hunter, Figueredo, and Malamuth in 2010 found a relationship between exposure to violence and non-sexual delinquency, while Way and Urbanek in 2008 reported that adolescents engaging in sexually offensive behaviors who also had prior delinquent behaviors were older and had higher rates of documented childhood maltreatment. In addition, Schaffner in 2007 noted that young women adjudicated delinquent in juvenile court often report suffering significant emotional, physical, and sexual trauma during early childhood and adolescence. Ryan, Williams, and Courtney in 2013 expanded on these findings, indicating that victims of child abuse and neglect are at an increased risk of involvement with both the juvenile justice and adult correctional systems. They emphasize that neglect plays a critical role in continued offending, noting the importance of parental monitoring, family relationships, and parental rejection in explaining juvenile conduct problems. Ryan and colleagues' study focused specifically on whether neglect is associated with recidivism among moderate and high-risk juvenile offenders in Washington state. By using official child protection records, they identified juveniles with a history of neglect, as well as those with ongoing neglect cases. Their findings revealed that adolescents experiencing ongoing neglect were significantly more likely to continue offending compared to youth with no official history of neglect, even after controlling for a wide range of family, peer, academic, mental health, and substance abuse factors. Based on these findings, it seems clear that abuse and neglect are empirically linked to delinquency and recidivism. Yet, it is important to ask, is the research conclusive? While it is almost certainly true that many delinquents have been abused or neglected, it does not necessarily follow that most abused or neglected youth will become delinquent. This distinction highlights a key principle of scientific theory. Empirical evidence alone is not enough. we must consider conceptual frameworks and other contributing factors in understanding the relationship between early maltreatment and delinquency. As we examine these studies, I want you to recall our discussions in Chapter 3 on abuse and neglect and think critically about what other factors might interact with early maltreatment to influence juvenile offending. Now let's turn our attention to the concept of scientific theory. Although dozens of conceptual schemes have been proposed to explain the causes of crime and delinquency, this chapter will focus on some of the more prominent attempts. A scientific theory can be defined as a set of two or more related empirically testable assertions, statements about facts or relationships among facts regarding a particular phenomenon. While this definition may sound complex at first, it becomes much clearer when we break it down. Essentially, a testable assertion is a statement about the relationship between two or more variables. In a valid theory, these assertions are related in a logical manner so that additional assertions can be deduced from the initial ones. For example, consider these propositions. Proposition 1. All delinquents are victims of child abuse and/or neglect. Proposition 2. Harry is a delinquent. Proposition 3. Harry is a victim of child abuse and/or neglect. Here, Proposition 3 is logically derived from Propositions 1 and 2. However, for a theory to be scientifically acceptable, at least some of the propositions must be empirically testable. If it turns out that Harry was not abused or neglected, then our explanation of delinquency would be incorrect, and the theory would need to be revised or rejected. It's important to note that behaviorists believe that many principles learned from the study of animal behavior can also be applied to humans. While conceptual schemes that suggest relationships between variables may be useful in describing delinquency or abuse, only a theory that is both logically correct and empirically accurate can truly explain these phenomena. Explanation is central because it allows us to prevent or control delinquency and abuse. In fact, all policies and practices in the juvenile justice system, whether intentional or not, are influenced by theory. For example, get tough policies stem from classical theory and hedonism. Policies emphasizing individual or group therapy are grounded in psychological or social psychological theory, and policies focused on neighborhood improvement, education, or job opportunities draw from social logical theories. As we examine various theories and conceptual schemes, it is useful to evaluate whether they meet the requirements of scientific theory and whether they help us understand offenses by and against juveniles. Klofus and Stoshevik noted that our understanding of crime has shifted dramatically over the centuries, from viewing crime as the work of the devil to seeing it as the rational choice of free-willed individuals to explaining it as the involuntary result of biological, mental, and environmental conditions, and then back to rational choice models. However, assessing criminological theory toward the end of the 20th century, Bernard concluded that little progress had been made in eliminating unsupported theories or verifying others. While efforts to empirically test theories have improved, they remain sporadic. A notable trend in theories of juvenile delinquency has been a move toward multidimensional, multidisciplinary approaches, recognizing that one-dimensional theories are unlikely to explain the wide range of delinquent behaviors observed. The goal of this chapter is to familiarize you with some of these numerous conceptual schemes, highlighting their strengths and weaknesses. For those who want more detailed information on specific theories, the suggested readings at the end of the chapter will be especially useful. Let's now examine some of the early theories developed to explain deviant behavior, including crime, delinquency, and mental illness. These early theories include demonology, classical theory, rational choice theory, deterrence theory, routine activities theory, and the positivist school. The first of these early theories is demonology, which was one of the earliest attempts to explain deviant behavior. According to this perspective, individuals who violated societal norms were thought to be possessed by evil spirits, which forced them to commit wrongful acts. In this view, deviance was not a product of free will, but rather determined by supernatural forces. Hence, demonology is considered a deterministic approach. To control or cure deviant behavior, various extreme techniques were employed, including trephining, or drilling holes in the skull to release evil spirits, as well as exorcisms, beatings, and burning. Unfortunately, these practices often resulted in death or permanent injury, and confessions obtained under torture were frequently unreliable, reflecting the pervasive brutality of this approach. Moving forward in time, we encounter the classical theory, which emerged in the late 18th century through the works of Cesare Beccaria in Italy and Jeremy Bentham in England. This theory represents a free will approach, asserting that humans act rationally and weigh the potential rewards and consequences before committing acts. In this framework, crime can be controlled by ensuring that punishments outweigh the perceived benefits of offending. By the early 1800s, this approach was modified, giving rise to the neoclassical approach, which recognized that certain individuals, such as the insane or juveniles, were less capable of rational calculation and therefore required mitigated punishments. The principles of the classical approach, i.e., punishment as deterrence, proportionality of punishment, and differential treatment of juveniles, remain foundational in modern criminal and juvenile justice systems. The rational choice theory, or post-classical theory, extends this notion by emphasizing that individuals consider the risks and rewards before committing crimes. For example, a burglar may evaluate the likelihood of getting caught and the potential gain before deciding to break into a home. This perspective aligns with conservative, get-tough approaches to delinquency, suggesting that rational actors may be deterred primarily through the threat of punishment rather than treatment. Closely related is deterrence theory, which examines the relationship between punishment and misbehavior at both individual and group levels. Specific deterrence focuses on preventing a particular individual from reoffending, whereas general deterrence considers the broader effect on society when one person is punished. Research shows that the deterrent effect of punishment depends heavily on certainty and swiftness, as well as the offender's perception of risk. However, evidence suggests that arrests and punishment do not always prevent future offending, especially for individuals who act impulsively, are intoxicated, or underestimate the likelihood of apprehension. Another extension of classical thought is routine activities theory, which posits that crime is a function of people's everyday behaviors. According to this theory, crime is more likely when motivated offenders encounter suitable targets in the absence of capable guardians. Research supports this, showing that juveniles who spend time in unstructured, unsupervised settings or engage in risky behaviors are more likely to experience victimization or commit delinquent acts. The theory also highlights the importance of environmental hotspots where crimes tend to recur. Despite the logic behind classical and related approaches, the effectiveness of severe punishment in preventing crime is limited. Many individuals do not always rationally calculate consequences, may underestimate risks, or may believe they will not be apprehended. Similarly, in families, severe punishment often fails to produce desired behavioral changes in children and can instead create cycles of abuse that continue across generations. Finally, we turn to the positivist school, which emerged in the second half of the 19th century. Cesare Lombroso, often considered the father of modern criminology, and other positivists such as Raphael Garofalo and Enrico Ferri emphasized determinism rather than free will. Positivists advocated for studying criminals scientifically and stressed empirical research showing on both hereditary and environmental factors as causes of criminal behavior. While their methods were rudimentary by today's standards, their work laid the foundation for modern criminology, including the biological perspective on delinquency. Now let's turn to biological theories of delinquency, an area that has shaped criminology for more than a century. Early biological theories assumed that delinquency was inherited, while modern approaches emphasize that offenders differ from non-offenders in certain physiological or biochemical ways. These explanations have ranged from hormonal imbalances and learning disabilities to genetic predispositions and nutritional factors. Today, Biological explanations have reemerged, often paired with sociological perspectives, suggesting that biology and environment interact to influence delinquent behavior. One of the most influential early figures was Cesare Lombroso, who proposed the idea of the born criminal theory. Lombroso claimed that some individuals were evolutionary throwbacks who could be identified by physical anomalies such as receding foreheads, large jaws, or pronounced ears. Although his specific claims have been discredited, his work was groundbreaking at the time because it attempted to study crime scientifically rather than morally or spiritually. After Lombroso, researchers continued searching for biological causes of delinquency through methods like twin studies and adoption studies, which examined whether criminality was more strongly linked to genetics or environment. These studies generally suggest that genetics play a role, but not a singular or determining one. Separating heredity from environment remains extremely challenging, and many findings highlight the importance of family, community, and learned behavior, rather than biology alone. Other early theorists, such as Sheldon, Hooton, and the Gluecks, attempted to link body type to delinquency. Sheldon, for example, argued that muscular, athletic body types, mesomorphs, were more prone to crime. Although patterns were observed, these explanations failed to account for why individuals with the same body type behave differently, making the theory scientifically weak. As the field progressed, researchers shifted toward more complex biological factors, such as learning disabilities, neurological conditions, chemical imbalances, and chromosome patterns. Studies have shown that certain neurological deficits and hyperactivity correlate with delinquency, but these relationships are influenced heavily by environmental factors such as social class, parenting, and access to support. Similarly, the once popular idea that the XYY chromosome caused criminality has not been supported by any reliable evidence. Modern research has taken a biosocial approach, recognizing that biology and environment work together. For example, studies have found that certain genetic traits predict delinquency only when combined with specific social environments, such as poor family relationships or delinquent peer groups. There is also evidence that violent victimization and delinquency share some genetic components, suggesting that certain inherited traits can increase vulnerability to both. Finally, contemporary biological and psychological researchers have begun developing interventions, such as dietary adjustments, neurofeedback, and medication, that attempt to address the biological components of behavior. As genetic research advances, especially with the ability to map human genomes, scholars continue to explore how biology and environment interact to shape delinquent behavior. Now let's turn to biosocial and neurological theories, often referred to as neurocriminology. This approach argues that criminal behavior is not explained by social factors alone. Neurological and physiological factors also play a significant role. Advances in neuroscience over the last 15 to 20 years have made this area especially influential. Research shows that many individuals who engage in antisocial or criminal behavior have structural abnormalities in the brain. These deficits may interfere with emotional regulation, impulse control, or reasoning. One of the most studied areas is the prefrontal cortex, which plays a central role in decision-making and self-control. A meta-analysis of brain scanning studies found that offenders were significantly more likely to have impairments in this region. Other work has shown that individuals with disorders such as antisocial personality disorders often have dysfunction in the amygdala, the part of the brain responsible for emotional responses. Adrian Raine in 2014 provided one of the most compelling cases demonstrating a direct neurological link between criminal behavior. The case of Michael Oft. Michael Oft lived a non-criminal life until the age of 40, when he suddenly began engaging in serious sexual offenses. A brain scan revealed a tumor pressing on his prefrontal cortex. Once the tumor was removed, his deviant behavior stopped immediately. Months later, when the tumor partially regrew, his criminal behavior resurfaced, only to disappear again after a second surgery. This rare case effectively replicated itself, offering unusually strong evidence that neurological abnormalities can directly cause criminal behavior. Cases like this, along with growing neuroscientific research, show why neurocriminology has gained significant support. While social factors still matter, neurological research increasingly demonstrates that brain structure and brain functioning are critical components in understanding and potentially preventing criminal behavior. Most research suggests that prenatal and neonatal health can influence later delinquent behavior. Studies have linked prenatal complications to developmental problems and increased delinquency risk. One landmark study found that nearly 80% of violent, chronically delinquent youth had delivery complications compared to 48% of non-offenders. However, findings are not entirely consistent. Some major studies, such as Deno in 1990 and Farrington in 1998, found no clear relationship between pregnancy complications and later violence. Mednick and Candle in 1988 found links to violent behavior only. Additional research indicates that maternal smoking and substance use during pregnancy can increase the likelihood of conduct disorders and behavior problems. Despite mixed results, researchers agree that the connection between prenatal care, birth complications, and delinquency warrants further study. Nauert in 2018 also highlights early health risks, such as poor nutrition, tobacco use, and drug or alcohol use during pregnancy, that can raise the likelihood of later delinquency. Because of this, medical professionals play an important preventative role. By identifying risk factors, providing prenatal education, and promoting healthy behaviors, nurses and doctors can help reduce future aggression and delinquency. As Liu, Lewis, and Evans note, effective prevention includes good prenatal care, screening for risks, and educating mothers about nutrition and avoiding harmful substances. Early childhood aggression is often linked to later violent behavior, and various early interventions can help. For instance, research shows that certain micronutrient supplements can reduce aggression in young children. Overall, emphasis on prenatal and neonatal health appears to be a promising approach to improving child well-being and reducing future delinquency. Psychological theories have long argued that the human mind plays a central role in abnormal or criminal behavior. Early psychological explanations focused on low intelligence and personality disturbances. Goddard, in 1914, concluded that feeble-mindedness contributed to criminality, while Goring, in 1913, also emphasized defective intelligence. Although researchers continue to explore the links between IQ and delinquency, concerns about the validity of IQ tests and personality measures have limited the strength of those findings. Despite these limitations, many still assume that serious offenders must be emotionally disturbed. Modern psychological theories provide a complex and often more cautious view. Sigmund Freud divided personality into the id, ego, and superego, arguing that deviance results when these components are imbalanced. A weak superego, an overpowering id, or a faulty ego could lead to delinquent behavior. Treatment centers on uncovering early childhood experiences through introspection and therapy. However, major weaknesses limit this psychoanalytic model. Its key concepts cannot be empirically tested, instincts may not operate as Freud believed, and practitioners often rely on subjective interpretations. Early studies claiming widespread emotional disturbance among delinquents have not held up. More recent research similarly finds little support for personality disturbances as a major cause of delinquency. The concept of psychopathy is frequently used to describe impulsive, aggressive offenders, but its definition is broad and sometimes vague. Because criminality is often treated as a symptom of psychopathy, it can be difficult to separate explanation from description. Research has attempted to clarify the concept through role-taking measures, case studies that show life changes in therapy can reduce psychopathic behavior, and assessment tools like the PPI and PCLR. Evidence also suggests a developmental link. Children with hyperactivity, impulsivity, attention problems, and conduct issues may be at a higher risk for adult psychopathy. Other research examining developmental psychopathology indicates that ongoing or adolescent maltreatment rather than early childhood only maltreatment is most strongly associated with later offending. Overall, the relationship between psychopathology, delinquency, and abuse remains uncertain, and evidence for effective treatment of psychopathy is limited. Behaviorism emerged as a response to the subjective focus of psychoanalysis and heredity-based theories. Psychologists such as Tarde argued that crime is learned, not innate, and B.F. Skinner in 1953 emphasized that behavior is shaped through conditioning, rewarding desirable behavior and punishing undesirable behavior. Unlike psychoanalysis, behaviorism focuses on observable, measurable behavior, which can be counted, modified, and evaluated. This makes it particularly promising for understanding and controlling delinquent behavior. Behaviorists argue that because delinquent behavior is learned, it can, at least in theory, be unlearned. Laboratory research has shown success in modifying behavior, though the degree to which these results transfer to real-world settings remains under study. Still, evidence is growing that certain behavioral approaches can reduce recidivism among both juveniles and adults. Cognitive behavioral therapy, or CBT, expands on behaviorist principles by helping individuals become aware of the thoughts, beliefs, and attitudes that drive their behavior. Once individuals recognize these patterns, supported by trained therapists, they can make meaningful changes. Research strongly supports CBT. It is effective across multiple populations, including offenders, substance abusing individuals, and incarcerated persons. Participants in CBT-based programs have lower rates of drug use and criminal activity than those receiving no treatment at all, and statewide youth training programs such as those in New York show promise in improving behavioral outcomes. Among adolescents who have left school, CBT has also been shown to reduce depression and anxiety. Several offshoots of CBT have also emerged. For example, mindfulness-based cognitive therapy for children, or MBCTC, improves attention and reduces anxiety symptoms in youths. A number of studies also show partial but meaningful improvements among juvenile offenders, particularly in areas such as self-control, social skills, and aggressiveness. Finally, a meta-analysis of over 500 studies found that cognitive behavioral skill-building programs are the most effective interventions for reducing recidivism, even for high-risk offenders. Across the past century, scholars have proposed a wide range of explanations for why young people engage in delinquent behavior. Some theories focus on social class and family differences, as seen in the work of Cloward and Olin, Cohen, and Miller. Others, like Merton's strain theory, emphasize how blocked educational and occupational opportunities can pressure youth toward delinquency. We also have theories that highlight the influence of neighborhoods and peer groups, including classic studies by Shaw and McKay and by Thrasher. Another major perspective, the labeling theory tradition represented by Becker, looks at how official reactions and labels can shape a young person's identity and future behavior. Despite their differences, most of these sociological theories share a common idea. Delinquency arises from social interaction, not from heredity or individual personality defects. From a sociological viewpoint, we can only understand delinquency by examining its social context. That means paying attention to the time and place of the behavior, the audience observing it, and the nature of the act itself. In the 1930s, Robert Merton adapted Durkheim's idea of anomie, the breakdown of social norms or the separation of individuals from widely accepted moral standards. Merton argued that strain occurs when people pursue culturally approved goals but lack the legitimate means to achieve them. According to his theory, individuals adapt to this strain in different ways. Some continue to conform, some retreat, some innovate, often through illegal behavior, and some rebel, potentially rejecting and replacing societal goals altogether. Moving into the 1950s, Albert Cohen applied Merton's ideas specifically to juvenile gangs. He suggested that lower-class youth face strain because they struggle to meet middle-class standards, especially in school. As a result, they reject those standards and create their own value system, leading to the formation of delinquent gangs. Walter Miller pushed back on Cohen's view, arguing that delinquency grows out of the focal concerns of the lower class, such as toughness, autonomy, and excitement, rather than simply inverted middle-class values. Skies and Matza then introduced the concept of delinquency and drift. They argued that juveniles don't necessarily commit crime because they are fully committed to a delinquent subculture. Instead, they drift in and out of delinquency by using techniques of neutralization, justifications such as denying responsibility, denying injury, blaming the victim, condemning those who judge them, or claiming loyalty to a higher group. Cloward and Olin expanded strain theory by focusing on differential opportunity. They argued that if an illegitimate opportunity structure is easily accessible, youth experiencing strain are more likely to move toward delinquency. In 1985, Robert Agnew proposed a major revision, general strain theory. Agnew argued that strain can come from failing to achieve goals, losing something of value, or confronting negative situations like repeated failure in school. He emphasized that many people simply want to be treated fairly, and when they perceive injustice, they may react with anger that can lead to crime. Later research by Agnew and others indicated that criminal victimization itself may be one of the most powerful forms of strain adolescence experience. Subsequent studies have explored various impacts of strain. Barron's work with homeless youth showed that multiple forms of strain, such as abuse, victimization, and deprivation, can contribute to crime either directly or when combined with other risk factors. Hay and Evans found that violent victimization increases delinquency, and that anger helps explain this connection, especially for youth with low self-control. Hollis and colleagues found that maltreatment leads to negative emotions, and delinquency, although negative, emotion may itself have a stronger effect than the maltreatment that caused it. Other research shows more mixed results. Sunokai and Kapasawa found that school-related stress increased delinquency among Asian youth, but generational conflict did not increase gang involvement as predicted. Jackson's national study showed that advanced pubertal development may intensify the effects of strain and that this relationship can differ by gender. Ryan's work suggested that delinquent peers can actually dampen the direct effect of strain on serious delinquency because peer involvement becomes a stronger influence than the strain itself. Higgins and colleagues found that peer rejection contributes to delinquency mainly among males. Finally, although strain theory remains debated, it continues to shape research. General strain theory in particular has renewed attention on how negative life experiences contribute to antisocial behavior, and many studies support this line of thinking. The ecological or social disorganization approach to delinquency emerged in the 1930s and 1940s and focuses on how crime is distributed across different areas of a city. Shaw and McKay's classic research showed that delinquency is not spread evenly. Instead, crime clusters in certain neighborhoods. Using Burgess's concentric zone model, they found that the highest delinquency rates consistently appeared in the zone of transition, the area between the central business district and more stable residential neighborhoods. These transitional zones were marked by physical deterioration, overcrowding, poor housing, poverty, unemployment, high mobility, and weak community cohesion. In short, these areas were socially disorganized. Shaw and McKay also emphasized that even when the population of these neighborhoods changed, when one ethnic group moved out and another moved in, the delinquency rates stayed high. This suggested that the place mattered more than the people themselves. Wilkes later summarized key patterns from early ecological studies. She found that delinquency varies widely by neighborhood, is highest near the city center, and decreases as you move outward. High crime areas tend to maintain their delinquency levels over time, even with demographic turnover. Areas with high truancy also show high juvenile court activity, and across ethnic groups, delinquency patterns follow the same spatial pattern: high in the center, low on the outskirts. Youth in high delinquency areas are more likely to reoffend and have repeated court involvement. Overall, delinquency follows the physical and social structure of the city. The logic behind this is straightforward. When social institutions like families, schools, and community organizations are weak or unstable, the street environment becomes the primary source of socialization. If delinquency is learned behavior, then neighborhoods filled with gangs, disorder, and criminal role models become powerful learning environments. Modern research continues to explore ecological effects. For example, Browning and colleagues found that moderate levels of commercial and residential density increase homicide and assault, but after a certain point, more density actually reduces those crimes. Robbery rates, however, rise consistently with density. Other studies point to alternative explanations. Lander argued that anomie, or normalness, better explained delinquency rates in Baltimore. Gibson found that low self-control predicts violent victimization differently, depending on neighborhood disadvantage. Steenbeek and others suggested that the business presence may increase neighborhood disorder, challenging the idea that only poverty and mobility matter. Despite criticisms, including the risk of committing the ecological fallacy, drawing conclusions about individuals based on group-level data, the social disorganization tradition remains influential. It laid important groundwork for later theories focusing on social interaction, control, and conflict. And one finding remains consistent. Certain neighborhoods develop long-standing patterns of delinquency, and in those communities, serious and repetitive misconduct can become a normal, even expected, part of everyday life. Let's turn our attention to Edwin Sutherland's differential association theory. Developed in 1939, this theory combines ideas from behaviorism, or learning theory, with the notion that behavior is learned through social interaction. For Sutherland, the primary group, like family or a peer group, is the main context in which individuals learn social behavior, including deviant or criminal behavior. According to Sutherland, individuals learn how to define situations as appropriate for law-abiding or law-violating actions. For example, one person might see an unattended newsstand as an opportunity to steal, while another might not. These definitions depend on prior experiences. Importantly, whether someone commits a criminal act depends on priority, or how early in life these definitions were learned, frequency, how often they were reinforced, duration, how long they are reinforced, and intensity, how important the definition is to the individual. One key point is that it's not simply association with criminals that predicts behavior, but rather exposure to definitions favorable or unfavorable to breaking the law. Research supports this. Moon, Huang, and McCluskey found differential association explains bullying among Korean youth, and Miller found that peer influence predicts delinquency in Mexican American adolescents. Differential association also helps explain intergenerational child abuse. Children who are abused may learn abusive behavior and later exhibit delinquent behavior themselves. Scudder and colleagues, and Siegel and Williams, show that abused children are at higher risk of breaking the law than non-abused peers. There are criticisms, of course. It can be hard to define or measure what counts as favorable or unfavorable definitions, and the intensity of exposure is difficult to quantify. How many exposures does it take to outweigh law-abiding definitions? Despite these challenges, Sutherland's theory offers a logical, testable framework for understanding how delinquency is learned, and has influenced many later researchers and theorists, including Ackers and Burgess. Now let's discuss labeling theory, which shifts our focus from the individual who commits a deviant act to society's reaction to that behavior. Key contributors to this approach include Becker in 1963 and Erikson in 1962. Becker emphasized the process of labeling deviants as outsiders, while Erikson highlighted the importance of the labeling ceremony, or the formal process by which society officially designates someone as deviant. From this perspective, it is not just the act itself, but when, where, and in front of whom the act occurs. For example, a juvenile using heroin in the privacy of a gang hangout may avoid official sanctions, but the same act in public in front of a police officer is likely to result in formal intervention. The labeling process typically follows a sequence: apprehension, confrontation through trial or hearing, judgment, and finally placement, incarceration, institutionalization, or probation. Once labeled, individuals may struggle to shed the stigma. For example, John Q. Convict does not easily become John Q. Citizen, but is instead often seen as John Q. Ex-convict. This stigma can make it difficult to find employment or form successful societal ties, which may push the individual back toward old associates and behaviors, thereby reinforcing a deviant career. Research supports this idea. Blankenship and Singh in 1976 and Covington in 1984 found that prior labeling and the type of label, legalistic or peer-based, affect future outcomes. Moreover, negative societal reactions can change an individual's self-concept, making rehabilitation more difficult. Braithwaite in 1989 contributed the concepts of disintegrative shaming and reintegrative shaming. Disintegrative shaming stigmatizes and isolates without reintegration, which can be socially destructive. Reintegrative shaming, on the other hand, attempts to restore the individual's connection to society, supporting positive reintegration. Labeling has been shown to influence long-term delinquency. Bernberg, Crone, and Rivera in 2006 found that juveniles processed by the juvenile system were more likely to join gangs and deviant networks. Similarly, Murray, Lober, and Pardini in 2012 noted that children in incarcerated parents may experience labeling and stigma that increases risks for delinquent behavior, poor academic outcomes, or substance use. Labeling theory focuses on secondary deviance, explaining how some individuals continue in a deviant career due to societal reaction, rather than addressing why the initial act occurred. It highlights the interaction between the deviant and the social audience. However, critics note that society's reaction is not arbitrary. Individuals genuinely bear responsibility for the acts that trigger labels. McGarrah and McVie in 2010 cautioned that early identification of at-risk children can unintentionally label and stigmatize them. Despite these limitations, labeling theory provides valuable insight into how deviance is socially constructed and maintained through interaction, emphasizing that both the individual and society play crucial roles. Now let's turn to conflict, radical, critical, and Marxist theories, which focus on the political and economic systems in society and how class relations influence crime. Chambliss, in 1984, described conflict theory as examining entire social, political, and economic systems and the struggles for power among diverse groups. Conflict exists in all societies, often along lines of gender, race, ethnicity, religion, or sexual orientation, as groups compete for power. Those who succeed in this competition often define what is considered criminal behavior at any given time. An important point is that conflict theory does not explain individual acts of crime outside of those societal contexts, but it does highlight how laws and their enforcement reflect inequalities. For example, consider the historical difference in treatment between marijuana and tobacco use among the youth. Severe sanctions for marijuana, but lenient treatment for tobacco, may reflect the political influence of the tobacco industry. The Marxist approach focuses on the repression of lower social classes by the ruling class. Laws are created and enforced by those with power, those who own wealth and resources, often criminalizing behavior that threatens the status quo. Radical and critical criminologists argue that labeling the discontented as criminals allows the ruling class to maintain control without addressing the underlying social inequalities. Radical criminology gained popularity in the US in the 1970s and 1980s, but has declined over time, with limited empirical research supporting the approach. However, studies like Einat and Herzog in 2011 have examined some aspects of conflict theory by looking at generational differences. Their research found that adults and teens often disagree on the seriousness of adolescent offenses, such as violent acts or drug use, providing some support for conflict perspectives. Conflict theory also considers how systematic disadvantages, such as child abuse, economic deprivation, and lack of political safeguards can contribute to delinquency. From this perspective, some youth are not only offenders, but also victims of social and structural inequalities. Social disorganization, racism, classism, and economic disadvantage can limit legitimate opportunities, increasing the risk of delinquency. Critics note, however, that the conflict perspective does not fully account for the role of the legal system in maintaining social order across all societies, including those claiming Marxist or socialist principles. As Clockars in 1979 observed, major Marxist criminologists rarely address the details of crime control in other societies, and Bohm in 2001 pointed out that purely capitalist or socialist societies likely never existed. In short, conflict, radical, critical, and Marxist theories provide a macro-level view of crime, emphasizing power, inequality, and the social construction of criminality, but they are less helpful in explaining individual-level offending. Now let's examine feminist theories in the study of crime and delinquency. Feminist approaches focus on women's experiences, particularly in relation to victimization, gender differences in crime, and the differential treatment of women by the justice system. Some feminists emphasize equal rights and participation. Others critique capitalist society, and still others focus on patriarchal oppression, male control over sex, money, and power, that contributes to women's second-class status. Traditional criminology has largely ignored female crime, raising questions about whether existing theories adequately explain female offending. Gender clearly affects the extent and nature of delinquency, but empirical support for gender-specific theories has historically been limited. Chesney Lind in 1989 examined female delinquency, particularly girls' aggression and violence, and found that increases in arrests often reflected changes in policing rather than actual changes in behavior. More recent research shows that young women use violence more often than commonly believed, often tied to concerns about status and respect, similar to young men. Creaney in 2012 noted that girls are often drawn into the system for welfare issues rather than crime, and juvenile justice policies often fail to address gender-specific needs. Martin et al. In 2013 highlighted that women are now the fastest growing segment of the criminal justice population. They identified victimization, mental disorders, and substance uses as major contributing factors to female involvement in crime. The National Girls Institute in 2013 identified 3 gender-responsive theories. Feminist pathways theory, which suggests that unique factors lead to female delinquency, including higher rates of victimization, mental health issues, substance use relationships with older partners, and self-harming behaviors. Early life experiences shape risk factors that create distinct pathways to justice system involvement. Relational culture theory, or RCT, focuses on the impact of relationships on female psychological well-being. Delinquency is often linked to disruptions or violations in meaningful relationships, whether within the peers, family, or broader society groups. Understanding these relational dynamics is key to understanding female delinquency. Intersectionality theory highlights that girls' experiences vary based on gender and other social identities. Race, ethnicity, and sexual orientation can influence how girls are treated by the justice system. For example, Girls of color or LGBTQ plus youth may experience disproportionate labeling, processing, or sanctions. Programs designed with intersectionality in mind must respect diversity and support positive identity development. Zoumakis, Lucier, and Corrado in 2012 explored intergenerational transmission of aggression, finding that mothers who were delinquent as youths were more likely to have children who exhibited early and higher levels of physical aggression. This underscores the importance of understanding female delinquency in motherhood in shaping antisocial behavior across generations. Research continues to support the idea that gender shapes both the causes and treatment of delinquency. Women generally commit a smaller percentage of violent crimes, but in cases like intimate partner homicide, female offending rates can approach those of men. To fully understand female offending, we must examine the circumstances and pathways leading women to commit serious acts of violence, including the social, psychological, and relational factors involved. Control theories propose that all individuals need to be held in check or controlled to resist the temptation to commit criminal or delinquent acts. These controls can be categorized as either internal or personal, or external or social. Containment theory, developed by Reckless in the 1960s, emphasizes the importance of both inner controls and external pressures on self-concept. According to this theory, a poor self-concept increases the likelihood that a juvenile will engage in delinquency, while a positive self-concept serves as a protective factor. Research has also linked negative self-concept to child abuse and neglect. Hershey's social control theory, developed in 1969, focuses primarily on social bonds rather than internal controls. Hershey identified 4 key elements of social bonds: attachment, commitment, involvement, and belief. Attachment refers to the emotional connections an individual has with others, with stronger attachments to non-delinquent peers reducing the likelihood of delinquency. Commitment involves an individual's investment in conventional activities, which discourages deviant behavior. Involvement in conforming activities reduces the time available for delinquency. Finally, belief in societal norms minimizes the likelihood of offending. Hershey argued that strong positive bonds across these 4 dimensions generally reduce delinquency, whereas weak or negative bonds increase the risk. Despite this, critics note that some juveniles with strong social bonds still commit crimes, and the exact relationship between self-concept and labeling remains unclear. In 1990, Hershey collaborated with Michael Gottfredson to develop the general theory of crime, which views criminal behavior as a form of deviance that is typically impulsive, poorly planned, and aimed at immediate gratification. Low self-control, shaped largely by early child-rearing practices, is central to this theory. Although it has faced criticism, this framework has generated extensive empirical research. Empirical studies support some of the predictions of control theory. Interventions designed to improve self-control in children up to age 10 have been shown to increase self-control and reduce delinquency, with positive effects observed across multiple contexts. Research on genetic and environmental influences indicates that low self-control and delinquency are affected by both genetic factors and non-shared environmental experiences, with shared environmental factors playing a minimal role. Parental attachment and peer associations also influence self-control and delinquency. Weak parental attachment and affiliation with gangs predicts low self-control and increased likelihood of police contact, though the patterns vary by race and ethnicity. Interestingly, research has found that delinquents may have friendships that are as strong or even stronger than those of non-delinquents, although self-control can affect these relationships. In conclusion, control theories highlight the importance of both internal self-control and social bonds in preventing delinquency. However, research indicates that these relationships are complex and influenced by multiple individual, social, and environmental factors. Understanding these dynamics is crucial for designing effective prevention and intervention strategies. Integrated theories in criminology attempt to combine 2 or more pre-existing theories to provide more comprehensive explanations of criminal and delinquent behavior. There are numerous integrated approaches, but some of the more prominent include developmental and life course theories, interactional theories, and other models that incorporate elements of multiple traditional frameworks. Developmental or life course theory, or DLC, which in this instance does not stand for downloadable content, seeks to explain how antisocial behavior develops over time, how different risk factors appear at different life stages, and how life events can differentiate and affect antisocial behavior. Moffat, in 1993 and 2006, developed a life course persistent versus adolescent limited theory, which distinguishes two types of antisocial behavior. According to Moffat, some individuals exhibit antisocial behavior throughout their lives, while others display it only during adolescence. Life course persistent offenders often experience neuropsychological problems beginning in prenatal development, which contribute to psychological disorders during childhood and facilitate delinquent behavior. These individuals also tend to grow up in disadvantaged neighborhoods and experience inadequate parenting. Interactional theory, proposed by Thornberry in 1987, integrates social learning, social bonding, and social structural theories. This theory views delinquency as the product of interactions among individuals, emphasizing that delinquent behavior is learned through social exchanges. For example, association with gang members can increase delinquency, while leaving the gang and interacting with less delinquent peers can reduce it. Hayes, in 1997, further developed an integrated model that incorporates elements of labeling theory, differential association, social learning, and social control theory. Using data from the National Youth Survey, Hayes demonstrated that weakened social controls increase opportunities for associating with delinquent peers, learning delinquent behavior, and committing initial delinquent acts. Initial delinquency increases the likelihood of being negatively labeled by parents, which in turn raises the probability of future delinquency. Hayes concluded that integrated theories offer a more complete understanding of juvenile delinquency than any single theoretical approach. Others integrated approaches include network analysis, control balance theory, and strain control hybrids. Robert Agnew, in 2012, proposed a general theory of crime and delinquency, which integrates decades of criminological research. This theory posits that delinquency is more likely when constraints against delinquency are low and motivations for delinquency are high. Agnew argues that constraints and motivations are influenced by factors across 5 life domains: self, family, school, peers, and work. These domains affect delinquency both directly and indirectly by shaping motivations for and constraints against crime. Empirical tests of the theory provide support for its core propositions. In conclusion, there are multiple theories of causation for delinquency. I think this video has gone on long enough, so I'll see you in Chapter 6.